I so I was praying. I was like, okay, Lord, what do I speak about on Resurrection Sunday? Like, obviously, like, there's that given Jesus died, rose, stuff like that. But I mean, I felt like I don't want to like say that message is redundant. We've heard it over. I don't want to say that because it's a great story. It's a really good story. It's the best story in the history of the world. It split history in half between AD or BC and AD. And it's a story that allows us to have eternal life in heaven with God. It changed the course of history for humanity. And so I don't want to sit there and say I'm not going to speak about it because we speak about it every Easter. But I wanted to see if maybe the Lord had something different that I could bring to the table and share with you guys today. And so I was kind of thinking about it and I was praying through it, and I just remembered like all of my favorite resurrection stories. Like there's just so many resurrection stories in the Bible. And none of them are as powerful and as magnificent of Christ's resurrection. But they all hold very good lessons for us. And when you tie them all together, because the thing about the Bible, the whole Bible is a redemption story and it's all tied together. And so if we just choose one part of it over another, whatever. But when you tie it all together, it's just this really beautiful, like intricately made piece that just is all woven together in just such beautiful ways that brings so much more redemption when you see the full story and everything like that. And so I've found there's a lot of stories, a lot of resurrection stories that I love, but I boiled it down to 4.5. And so I'm gonna try and go quick. I want to preface with each one of these stories I'm about to share with you guys and bring to the table for y'all. You could literally unpack every single one of these in and of themselves and create a whole entire lesson series. So they're very meaty. Like there's a lot of meat in each one of these individual stories, but I'm just gonna pick out a few things of each of them. So I'm probably going to bypass a lot of like really good points that I would really love to give y'all, but I don't have 10 years today, so can't do that. But so we're actually going to start I was kind of, okay, where do I start, And so I figured, well, let's start at the end. Let's start with the last resurrection story before Christ's resurrection, and it was the last resurrection power that we see of Christ before his own, and it's the story of Lazarus. And so we'll be in John 11 for this story. And so the backstory of this, we're not going to read the whole thing. I'll kind of summarize it. Lazarus is a really good friend of Jesus, and his sisters are Mary and Martha, the two that sat at Jesus's feet or continually cooked and then tattled on her sister. That was Martha. And so they're really good friends, and Mary and Martha send word to Jesus, and they say, hey, Lazarus, the one you love, is sick. And Jesus says, oh, okay, well, I'm not coming. And it's kind of like a very opposite of what you think Jesus would do. If he truly loved Lazarus, wouldn't he go running to help save him? Like, he's rescued all these other people. He's raised all these other people from death. He's healed all these other people. And so we see in verse 4 that Jesus says, but when Jesus heard about it, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. Let that sink in. He's telling them, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. So I find it interesting because Jesus loved Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, he didn't come. Because he loved them, he didn't show up and rescue Lazarus from death. And I find it interesting that Jesus says within it, he knows that this story isn't going to end in death. He knows it's going to end in his glory being magnified. Yet, as we continue through the story, we find out that Jesus finally says, hey, disciples, we're going to go wake Lazarus up. They don't get what he's talking about because they don't read between the lines and they think he's just sleeping. But he's like, no, guys, Lazarus died. We're going to go raise him from the dead. And so they go. And we find out that it has been 4 days. It has been 4 days that Lazarus has been in the grave. And I want to point that out, the 4 days, because 4 days may not seem significant, but when you know Jewish history, when you know Jewish culture, so when I was in Israel, I didn't know this until I went to Israel. We passed by a cemetery, and there are these little square holes in the concrete thingy things over the graves. And so we asked our tour guide, we're like, what do those concrete, or what do those holes, what are they for? And he was saying that Jewish tradition and Jewish culture believes that you have 3 days for the soul to return to the body. And so you have 3 days for the soul to actually come back and a chance of resurrection. At the 4-day mark, all hope is lost. There is no more hope. Nothing can be done. It's past the point of no return. There's absolutely nothing. And so that 4 days is very significant, because here we have Mary and Martha who know Jesus' power. They know that he can raise people from the dead, heal people from sickness. Yet on the 4th day, they know, based on their tradition, based on their culture, there's no hope at the 4-day mark. There's absolutely nothing. And so we look back and we see Jesus says that his story will not end in death. We see that he says this is happening for the glory of the Lord. And we also see that he loves and cares about Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And so it kind of just got me thinking, there's things in our lives that, we've been begging the Lord for, or we have been desperate for. Maybe it's healing, maybe it's deliverance from sin, maybe it's some physical ailment, maybe it's out of a financial situation, and we're at this point of no return. We feel like all hope is lost. We feel like we're at day 4, and we're sitting at day 4, and we're asking God, why have you not healed me? Why have you not pruned this out of me? Why have you not raised me up? Why have you not healed me? Why did you allow me to get to day 4? And it's all because Jesus loves you, because he cares about you, because he knows if he doesn't let you get to day 4, then you're not going to see the real miracle, because the real miracle happens on day 4. It doesn't happen on day 1, 0, 2, 3. It happens on day 4. And so as we continue, Mary and Martha run out to Jesus, and they have words with him. Why? You could have stopped this, but you didn't. But we see that they still, verse 27, Martha says, "Yes, Lord," she told him, "I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God." So we see that even though she's kind of like hurt that Jesus didn't save her brother, but he saved all these other people that were strangers, we see that she still believes. She still believes in his power, in his glory, in his goodness, that he is who he says he is. And so we continue forward and we go to verse 35, and we see that Jesus wept even though he knew what was going to happen. We see it in verse 4. Jesus knew his story wouldn't end in death. He still had compassion. He still wept. He was still there mourning with his friends, even though he knew what he was about to do. And as we continue forward in verse 38, we see Jesus give this command to the people. He says, "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." And so Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of these people standing here so that they would believe you sent me." I just find Jesus, he's like, these people are stupid, so I'm going to say this out loud so that they understand what's really going on. Sorry, I just love his humor, or his personality, I guess. And then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. And Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." And so this whole story kind of just reminded me, we have sin in our lives. We have pain. We have things that have been done to us. Maybe it's not sin, but maybe it's something, it's a weight that we're carrying. It's something that's been done to us. And God is calling us to be vulnerable. If we look right here, it says, Jesus commands them to roll away the tomb. The man who had the power to raise Lazarus from the dead on the fourth day is telling us to roll away the stone on the tomb. Couldn't he have just rolled it away himself? No. We need to roll away the stone in our hearts. We need to move that stone, be open and vulnerable. And we see here that Martha didn't want that to happen because of the stench, the smell. There's some things within us that we just don't want to take that stone away. We don't want to roll that stone away and be vulnerable and be open to the people around us because we're afraid that that stench and that smell is going to come out. And we're afraid that people are going to run away. They're not going to like it. But in all reality, if we're in a good community of people, if we're in with people who are for us and are trustworthy, when we roll that stone away of our hearts and we allow that vulnerability for people to see within our tomb, then we can experience the resurrection power of Christ. But that resurrection power of Christ is not the end of that story. We see that Lazarus probably comes hopping out. So here's actually the first bunny rabbit. It's not Easter, it's Lazarus hopping out in his grave clothes. And he's bound. He has grave clothes all around him. And so what does Jesus do? He tells everybody that's onlooking to unwrap him and let him go. So first you have to move the stone away from your heart. You need to be vulnerable, allow people in. Then Jesus can work his resurrecting power, but then we still need community to come and help us out. We still need community to come and help us take off our grave clothes. And I can tell you this, those grave clothes probably stank. While Lazarus was raised from the dead, those grave clothes were sitting in a rotting body for 4 days. And those grave clothes were probably not the nicest things to unwrap off of a body that just got raised from the dead. And so we need to be able to have a trusted community around us. So the next resurrection that we're going to go to is in 1 Kings 17. I was telling one of my friends, I absolutely love the Kings. It's probably one of my favorites. Like 1st and 2nd Kings. There's a lot of books in the Bible that are my favorite, but Kings are probably, I don't know, the stories just, they're I don't know what it is about them, but they make a lot of sense to me. So we're going to go, it's the whole chapter is 17, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to summarize. So King Ahab was the most wicked king in the history of Israel. He really led the people away from the Lord. And so God sent the prophet Elijah to come and prophesy that there would be a drought and there would not be rainfall at all until the Lord said that there would be. And so this really upset King Ahab, and so Elijah had to run for his life, and the Lord he guided Elijah and told him to go to the brook, the Kerith brook. And so we see in verse 5, so Elijah did as the Lord told him, and he camped beside the Kerith brook, east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. So that's really cool. Like, you have somebody after your life, somebody's threatening to murder you, somebody's threatening to kill you, and the Lord guides you to this, probably, I just imagine this like beautiful, like safe haven of a brook, just nature picturesque type thing with these ravens coming and bringing bread. And so we see, not only do we see God's guidance and direction, but we see his provision, his protection, and we also see a miracle. I mean, it's kind of miraculous that ravens know to bring him food. And so we see him sitting in this miracle, and it's beautiful. God provides. It's awesome. But then we get to verse 7. But after a while, the brook dried up, and there was no rainfall anywhere in the land. So we know this drought has been going on for a hot second, and this brook has dried up. And that kind of made me start to question, okay, so why would God lead Elijah to this provision if he knew that he had already orchestrated a drought that would dry up the provision? Why does God call us somewhere when he knows in a matter of moments he's just going to uproot us and send us somewhere else? And so it kind of just got me thinking, when in life has a brook dried up for you? And as we see, the brook dried up, and so the Lord gave him another direction. He gave him another command, another guidance. And he said to go to Zarephath. And he said, there you'll find a woman, and she's going to feed you. And so Elijah goes to Zarephath. He finds a widow. He tells her to make bread. And she says, well, I am going to make the last bread that I can make, because this is the last ounce of flour and the last ounce of oil that I have, and then me and my son are going to eat it and die. And Elijah tells her, just do it anyways. Trust me. If you feed me first and you do what I say, then the Lord will provide the oil and the flour for you throughout the whole entire drought. You won't run out. And so she does it. And so we see in verse 15, so she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her son continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. And so I think that's interesting, like we're at this provision, this brook of provision, and the ravens are miraculously feeding us. And then it dries up. Okay, cool. God calls us to Zarephath. We feed this woman. Okay, awesome. Like, life is hunky-dory. Like, everything is good. And then again, tragedy strikes. We get to verse 17, and we see sometime later, the woman's son became sick. He grew worse and worse, and finally he died. Okay, then why did you send me to Zarephath anyways? Why would you send me to Zarephath if, this to save this family if the son is going to die? And so we continue on, and we see the widow is angry at Elijah. She questions Elijah. She thinks it's Elijah's fault. Elijah takes the boy, and he cries out to the Lord, and he questions. He's like, God, why would you do this? Why would you allow this son to die after all the provision that this family has done for me? But despite the questions and the uncertainty and not knowing, we see that he stretches himself out over the boy 3 times. He prays to the Lord to revive the son. And we see in verse 22 that the Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned and revived. Okay, so we could have just skipped all of that. If A, there was never a drought, we could have skipped all of that. If B, the son never died. What was the point of the death? What was the point of the son dying? And we see in the last verse of this chapter, in verse 24, then the woman told Elijah, now I know for sure that you are a man of God, and that the Lord truly speaks through you. So the son had to die so that this woman, this family, could see that Elijah truly was who he said he was. He was a prophet of God, and everything that he said was true. It was ordained. It was anointed by the Lord. And when I first read this story years ago, I wrote in my Bible, what brook is drying up that God is calling you from so he can use you to bring life and revival? And I want to take that further and ask you guys, what brook is drying up that God is calling you to leave, but you're clinging on to, whether it's sin? Is it maybe mentality? Is it an actual physical place? Is it a school, a church? Is it a home? Is it a city? Is it a state? What is the brook that is drying up that God is wanting you to leave because he has resurrection power for you to bring to somebody else that you cannot bring it to until you leave that brook, that former provision? Because this isn't about Elijah. What's interesting is this, even though God provided for Elijah, this story isn't about Elijah. Because if you think back, if Elijah never was sent to that brook and that brook never dried up, he would have never gone to Zarephath. If Elijah never went to Zarephath, he would have never been able to perform the miracle of the life-sustaining food. If he never performed the miracle of the life-sustaining food, then the widow and his son would have died, or her son would have died anyways. But yet they still lived. Let's just say some good Samaritans gave them food and they didn't die. This son would have died. And all of this was so that the glory of the Lord could be known. So that this woman, this widow, and her son could know the glory of the Lord. And so the question with this one is, what is the brook that God is calling you to leave? What is the brook that has dried up that you need to let go of and you need to leave so that God can move you forward to bring resurrection power to somebody else that needs it? Because it's not about us. It's about others, and it's about God. And so next we're going to go, this is a little tour, just FYI, we're flipping through the Bible. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, but we're going to go to 2 Kings 13. And here we see Elisha. So this is a story of Elisha, who was the pupil of Elijah. Long story short, Elijah did 8 miracles in his life. And Elisha, the student, was a little ambitious, and he wanted to do twice as many as his teacher. And so, long story short, skipping over all the details because we will be here for 10 years if I say them all, Elijah promised Elisha that he would have a double portion ministry. And he promised that he would do twice as many miracles. But we see here in this chapter, it's pretty interesting because there's a evil king Jehoash, which is not a good king, but he does recognize the importance of the prophets of God. And he's mourning over Elisha because Elisha is on his deathbed. And so we see in verse 20 that Elisha is dead, dies, and he's buried. But when he died at the point of death, he died at miracle 15. Where's the 16th miracle? Where's the double portion? He died before the promise could be fulfilled. And so this one got me thinking, okay, like, what has God promised you that just, it seems dead? It seems like it's completely destroyed and that it's ended. And it ended before anything could come to fruition. Nothing has come to fruition. Nothing has passed. What has died that, you know, you're upset about, or, you know, you feel cheated because you were promised this double portion and you only got 15. You didn't get 16 miracles. And so we continue with verse 20. It says, "A group of Moabite raiders used to invade the land each spring. Once when some Israelites were burying a man, they spied a band of these raiders. So they hastily threw the corpse into the tomb of Elisha and fled. But as soon as the body touched Elisha's bones, the dead man revived and jumped to his feet." And then literally, it's just like that verse is about that one miracle, and then the rest of the chapter is about this war and prophecy of this war with Syria. Sorry. But what I thought was interesting about that was Elisha was dead. He was in his weakest. He was in the absolute most distraught situation he could find himself in. He had no life. He was dead. He was weak. And it just reminds me, you know, Paul says, "In my weakness, he's made strong. I must decrease so that he can increase." And this resurrection happened in death, and the death of the person who was performing the miracle. The person who performed the miracle wasn't even alive. And it's all to show that when God moves through us, he's not using us. He's using us, but it's not us. We are dead. We are, you know, in our weakness, he can still use us. When we feel at our weakest, God can still bring the promise that he's given us into fruition. We can still have that double portion. We just need to keep Christ the center. We need to keep God our focus, and we need to continue living a life for him. And so all of these stories, just all together, there's a lot of death. There's a lot of things that need to die, things that we need to be vulnerable about and bring in a community. We need to leave some things behind, or we need to understand that even in our weakness, God can still use us. And even when everything, all hope seems lost, the promise that he gave us can still be fulfilled. But it's all about one thing. It's all about resurrection. This whole Bible is about resurrection. Everything within this Bible from beginning to end is about things dying and God bringing them back to life. Is about the hope of the world being completely, you know, our fellowship with God being broken with Adam and Eve, and then having to find this fix, this way for us to have fellowship with him again. And this whole entire book is about revival, is about resurrection. Even to Revelations, we're going to be resurrected. And so on Resurrection Sunday, where we remember Christ's resurrection, we remember that's his story. You know, God is the God of resurrection, and he is not willing that any story ends in death. He doesn't want a single story to end in death. And all we have to do is believe that he is going to bring life. And it may not look like we think it is. It may not happen on day 3. And it may not happen when we're alive and in our strongest. And, you know, it may not happen where we think it's going to happen. We might have to leave things behind. But God is not willing that any story ends in death. He is the God of the resurrection story. He is God of new life. And so Jesus rose from the dead, and we see that he's on earth for 40 days, and he's hanging out with his disciples and the people that he's done ministry with. And we see on the last day, right before he's ascending, we see in Matthew 28:18-20, that Jesus gives this commission. And he says, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. And be sure of this, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." So why did Christ die? Obviously, he died so we could have eternal life. But it doesn't stop there. Remember Elijah? It's not about us. It's about the widow at Zarephath. It's about somebody else. It does not stop with us. The resurrection does not end with us. And if we let it end with us, then we are in a great, we are allowing the resurrection to be wasted for somebody else. It's not wasted on us. Jesus' death and resurrection isn't wasted on us, but it's wasted on somebody else that he has ordained us to go out and speak to. And so I want to go to my last resurrection story, which is somewhat kind of speaks to my morbid side. I don't know why. I don't know. There's part of it that I just love the morbidity of it. But I'm going to read this whole, not the whole chapter, but this whole portion. And it's in Ezekiel 37. And some of you might know what this is, but this one gets me pretty fired up. So we're going to start off. Ezekiel is a prophet of the Lord. And this is Ezekiel talking about a vision that he has seen that the Lord has given him. And he says, "The Lord took hold of me, and I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with bones. He led me all around among the bones that covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground and were completely dried out. Then he asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones become living people again?' 'O sovereign Lord,' I replied, 'you alone know that answer.' Then he said to me, 'Speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, "Dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am going to put breath into you and make you live again. I will put flesh and muscle on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath into you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord.' So I spoke this message just as he told me. Suddenly, as I spoke, there was a rattling noise all across the valley. The bones of each body came together and attached themselves as complete skeletons. Then as I watched, muscles and flesh formed over the bones. The skin formed to cover their bodies, but they still had no breath in them. Then he said to me, 'Speak a prophetic message to the winds, Son of man. Speak a prophetic message and say, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, O breath from the four winds, breathe into these dead bodies so they may live again." So I spoke the message as he commanded me, and breath came into their bodies. They all came to life and stood up on their feet, a great army. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones represent the people of Israel. They are saying, 'We have become old, dry bones. All hope is gone. Our nation is finished.' Therefore, prophesy to them and say, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I will open your graves of exile and cause you to rise again. Then I will bring you back to the land of Israel. When this happens, O my people, you will know that I am the Lord. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live again and return home to your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done what I said. Yes, the Lord has spoken." If that passage of scripture does not get you fired up about prophesying to people, about going out and being the vast army, a great army for the kingdom, then I don't know what does. This passage has always just gotten me fired up. But when I read it, I was in a season, when the Lord first brought this to me, I was in a dry season, and I was desperate. And I was desperate to be brought back to life. But I'm sitting here and I'm reading it during this season that we're in with, that leads us to have our small group on Zoom because of COVID-19. And I'm just thinking, and I'm reading in verse 11 where he says, we have become old dry bones. All hope is gone. Our nation is finished. There are so many people out there, not just in our nation, but in our world, that don't have Christ. Not just that, there's so many Christians that their faith is dry. Their passion is dry. Their passion for bringing kingdom to earth, their passion for bringing the gospel to people who need it is dry. And we need the breath of God to be breathed back into us. And once it's breathed back into us, we can't stop there. We have to breathe it out so that we can help these dry bones come back to life, so that God can use us to bring these dry bones back to life. And there's so many, I think, for Christians, I think as soon as this pandemic started, a vast majority of us realized that God was breathing his breath back into us. He was making our bones come back to life. Our dry bones were no longer dry. Our faith was no longer dry. Our passion was no longer dry. He was bringing us back to life. The flesh was coming back onto us. We were being awakened. But we weren't being awakened for nothing. We were being awakened to be an army that changes this world for Christ, to be an army that breathes the message of hope. God is calling us from a brook that has dried up so that we can be an army that breathes hope into somebody who is dying. God has called us into deeper healing, to be vulnerable, to take the stones away from our hearts, and to be open and allow community in so that we can breathe the hope of the gospel into other people. God has called us to remember a promise, and even in our weakness to trust that God can still use us, because we will be weak, but he can still use us to perform miracle and resurrection for somebody else, even when we were at our lowest, because we need to breathe hope. Your story will not end in death because you have Christ in your heart, because you are a Christian. And just like Lazarus, Jesus is saying your story will not end in death, but there are so many people out there that have dry bones, that if we do not breathe the gospel into them, that if we don't allow God to breathe through us, their story will end in death. Their story will end in complete and utter destruction and separation from the Lord. And so this isn't about us. This isn't about, if it's about us, it's so that we can get our hearts right, so that we can breathe into others. None of this is about us. The hope of the resurrection that, for these once dried bones is so that the lost can breathe in the hope that their story will not end in death, but that their story will end in life. And so as we remember Christ today, and as we remember the sacrifice that he made, and just his resurrection power. He overcame the grave. He conquered death. He defeated death. He's fat in connected. And as we remember that, I'm going to play a song. We're going to do communion again to remember Jesus. I don't think we can do it too much. We're actually commanded to do it as often as we meet together to remember him. But I'm going to play a song, and the song I'm playing isn't really like a communion song. It's more of like blessings. It's called The Blessings, and it's by Carrie Jobs, whatever. But this song just really resonated with my heart, of just God has blessed us so that we can bless others, and He has brought us back to life so that we can bless others. And so this is just a almost like a prayer in a song of future favor and blessings upon your life. And my prayer for you guys in this song is that, God will give you the favor and the blessings that you need so that you can speak to others. So I'm going to play this song. Go ahead and shut off your videos if you want. I'm going to shut off mine. And then we're going to take communion, and then we're going to go from there. So one